The Prince of Wales, meanwhile, continued to grow in popularity. Edward earned the sobriquet the Sporting Prince, acknowledging his enthusiasm for all sports from golf to hunting. He was popular too with the armed forces, both veterans and serving.
A youthful veteran himself, he had just the right touch for the old soldiers and the disabled.
He continued his tours of empire, and later in the 1930s took on the role of British trade ambassador to the republics of South America.
In Montevideo, the troops turned out to welcome him. But it was in matters of trade that this visit to Uruguay, Chile, and the Argentine carried special success.
All the heir to the throne lacked was a wife. Although the country had rejoiced in the marriage of the king's second son, Albert, it more eagerly anticipated the wedding of the Prince of Wales. Prince Edward, though, was in no hurry to marry. He preferred the company of married women.
It's quite interesting to think about David and Bertie vis-à-vis women. They'd spent most of their early life, their biggest influences really would have been kind of like their nannies, and they were probably, to some extent, and it's maybe a characteristic of members of the royal family, looking for somebody to sort of almost take them in hand and look after them. There's certainly an evidence of that, I think, with David.
The difference in lifestyle between the two princes was now very marked.
Yes, darling, the Prince of Wales himself.
The Prince of Wales moved in a fast, smart set. He went skiing and took holidays in the south of France. The Yorks began a family. The Duke always referred to "we four" when talking of his wife and two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. Their preference was to spend time together at home or in the country. But whatever their differences, both the Duke and Duchess of York were hugely fond of the Prince of Wales. When the couple moved into their Windsor home Royal Lodge, they often joined the Prince of Wales and his married mistress, Lady Thelma Furness, at Edward's nearby mansion, Fort Belvedere, also located in Windsor Great Park. Although they hoped Edward would find a suitable wife, they accepted Thelma.
Whenever the Prince of Wales had, as it were, a mistress, be it Frida Dudley Ward or Thelma Furness, you know, they were, these women were not a particular threat, and he, of course, was quite a sort of powerful figure within the family. So if he had a party and they all came to it, of course they all mixed together. What they thought privately about these ladies is another matter.
The Duke and Duchess may have met and mixed with Thelma Furness, but the same could not be said for the woman who replaced her as the object of Prince Edward's affections, Wallis Simpson. An American, the twice-married Wallis was introduced to the prince by Thelma Furness. In return, by 1934, Mrs. Simpson had ousted her friend as the Prince of Wales' mistress. Edward was by now besotted with Wallis. She was said to dominate the prince, and his brother Albert resented the way Wallis had cut him off from his siblings.
I think that Mrs. Simpson's mistake, in a sense, was when she met him, she flirted with him as if he was a film star or a tycoon without understanding his position and who he was. And she captured a damaged man, indeed longing to escape.
There was nothing the Duke of York could do in the face of the Prince of Wales' increasing infatuation with Wallis, except hope that it would pass. It didn't. Instead, the prince flaunted his relationship with the American, whether at private functions, public events, or even on holidays together. He grew increasingly weary of his eldest son's wayward behavior, so much so, before his death, he wrote, "I pray God that my eldest son will never marry and have children." King George V died on the 20th of January 1936, a year that would send shockwaves through the British nation and empire. For the Duke of York, it would transform into the most difficult year of his life. The Prince of Wales was proclaimed King Edward VIII. Unremarked in the press, but a sign of things to come, Edward broke royal protocol by watching the proclamation of himself as king from a window of St. James's Palace, with the still married Wallis at his side.
Times were very different. The press was controlled by certain very powerful figures like Lord Beaverbrook and so forth, and they did all agree that nothing should be said in the newspapers about this. And so you have this extraordinary situation that what you might call society, which is a relatively small group of people, all knew exactly what was going on, and yet the British public knew nothing about her at all.
Edward's popularity was at its height. Although pre-television, he was the most photographed person in the world, the pin-up prince, now turned king. But though adored by his subjects, the king was not popular with his courtiers. Edward VIII resented spending time attending to state business. He paid only minimal attention to his duties as a constitutional monarch. But worst of all, as it seemed to the royal court, King Edward had only one real interest, and that was Wallis. For her part, Wallis was alarmed by reports in the American press about her relationship with the king.
Today, the American press is filled with rumors of royal romance, of the possibility of King Edward marrying Mrs. Wallis Simpson, the former Baltimore belle.
In September that year, Wallis wrote to the king, suggesting they call a halt to their relationship. The king responded that he would take a knife to his throat rather than endure life without Wallis.
I'm sure that there were at least one, if not two, occasions when she seriously panicked. And the last thing she wanted to be was this evil woman, the woman who stole the king and all that. And actually, to some extent, that's really rather an unfair appellation, because he was the one who wanted to go, and she, to some extent, was the victim.
It was a frustrating time for the Duke of York, as the king had all but stopped communicating with his brother. But it would be late October before the Duke would fully comprehend the direction of unfolding events. He was informed that Wallis Simpson was divorcing her husband. The Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had appealed to the king to prevent the divorce going ahead, but the king had refused his request. The Duke was also told the saga might end with his brother's abdication.
I think that it took Albert quite a long time to realise what was going on, because he really didn't see his brother. I think after her divorce, in Ipswich I think it was, that the full horror burst on him, that actually the chances were that David would choose Wallis and give up.
To marry Wallis Simpson once her divorce was finalised. Baldwin, playing for time, agreed to consider the king's proposal, consulting with his cabinet and with the dominions of the British Empire. He warned, however, that marriage was most likely unacceptable because remarriage after divorce was opposed by the Church of England and because the public would never accept Mrs. Simpson.
Can a king separate his personal life from his public duty?
The king was given three choices: to finish his relationship with Mrs. Simpson, to marry against the advice of his ministers, who would then resign, or to abdicate. The Duke of York could only watch in horror. He told his private secretary, "I feel like the proverbial sheep being led to the slaughter." The king remained defiant until the last. The Prime Minister was far from certain the king would go.
As Mr. Baldwin goes to the House of Commons, there is tension in Downing Street. What action His Majesty will take still seems to be a royal secret.
Finally, Edward chose in favour of love. He signed the instrument of abdication on the 10th of December 1936, his reign having lasted just 327 days. The following evening, Edward, now to be known as the Duke of Windsor, made his abdication broadcast.
You must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love.